On Out, people, is a very good follow-on from the one you just heard. Marco, Deanna?
Yep.
Here we are.
Don't want to lose you. So we just heard a whole amazing conversation, which I thought I learned a lot from, about the myriad new forms of data that are coming into existence. And we could go on for almost endlessly, certainly months, with that same kind of conversation, and we'd keep learning new things because data collection of all sorts is happening at a pace and scale and in a diverse way that's never been possible before. So what we're going to discuss on this session is what can we do with that data? What does it mean? And so just quickly, here we have Marco Annunziata, who's the chief economist at GE, and a serial techonomist, as we like to say. And just quickly, what have you done? Give us a quick career summary, Marco.
So I started off as an economist, did my PhD in economics, then I worked at the International Monetary Fund, so doing policy work in emerging markets and industrial economies for about 6 years, then went into investment banking, always on the research side, and 6 years ago I saw the light and GE attracted me and I went into industry and technology and I've never looked back.
It's an interesting place to be, so cool.
It's fascinating.
Now, Deanna I've known for quite some time. When she was running the McKinsey Global Institute, did you help create the McKinsey Global Institute? Or
No, its founding partner, it started before me. It focused only on the productivity question.
Yeah, the mic needs to go up there.
And so can you hear me if I speak up?
Yeah.
And so we expanded beyond productivity to a whole range of different things, but I was not the founder. I was the one who expanded it.
Yeah, and then you've been recently in the White House doing, what were you doing there exactly?
I was the deputy director of the National Economic Council, right, during the transition and the first 2 years of the administration.
And now you have started the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute. So
Yes.
Quickly describe what that is.
Let me tell you what it is, because it's a very exciting thing for many people in this room. So if you think about the way we understand our economy today, it's based primarily on an architecture of data collection that emanated from the Great Depression, when we didn't understand what was happening then, and then subsequently was upgraded after the Second World War. But it's got at its heart a certain view of the economy that is very old economy, and it has at its heart a survey-based approach to understanding what's happening. We were just talking on the way over here that survey-based approaches, i.e. poll-based approaches, are very problematic. So what we're doing at the J.P. Morgan Chase Institute is we're saying, think about the window that J.P. Morgan Chase has on the world through all the transactions and all the operations that it has. And if we could translate those data into what we would recognize as economic concepts, that's an incredibly strong sensor on what's happening. And so we are, in fact, coding these data into our own data assets and developing from that a perspective on the household sector, on consumers and individuals, the small business sector, and eventually we'll move on to the financial market sector too. So it's, think big data, technology platforms meets behavioral economics against a $2.4 trillion balance sheet of activities, which is what JP Morgan Chase is.
Well, you know, you've really gone, I mean, mentioning the problem with polling right to one of the most relevant things about a data session right this minute is that data has recently failed us to a tremendous degree. Everyone. I mean, even the Trump campaign themselves thought he was going to lose. So something happened that was problematic that we have to find a way to avoid in future, and not just in political campaigns. I think a crisis probably is descending on the field of polling right now in a major way. I would hope that it would extend even to things like VLS and how it functions, although I doubt it. But I mean, the other thing that I want to just put on the table, and I really can hear anything you want to say about it, either one of you, that came up in our opening session, is this fact that the data shows that life is getting better by every measurable indicator, not just in the United States, but in almost literally every country except maybe Russia. Yet people feel their lives are worse. They don't believe the data, or else I think it's not just that the data is meaningless to them. They don't have a sense of self-worth, which we've talked about in the dignity issue, which I think is real. But people literally don't believe the data. And there was a big piece in the paper just this last week about how, you know, Trump successfully got many of his followers to question the legitimacy of BLS data and about the U.S. economy, and saying that it was rigged to favor the incumbent administration, whereas in fact it's career civil servants that do it. They've been doing it for Republicans, Democrats. They keep doing it the same way. Maybe it's wrong, but it's not because it's rigged. It's just because it's sloppy or poor methodology that's outdated. So, and at the same time, I think, and I want you both to talk about this, we have this opportunity to make everything work better with data. So how do we square that, whatever that metaphor is?
So there's so many aspects to this, which is fascinating. So first of all, I feel extremely strongly about the idea that things are getting better. It's something that's been driving me crazy over the last 5 to 6 years when you look at the performance of the US economy, and it's been improving, and yet everybody tells you constantly that we are still in a recession and things are getting worse, and it's just not true. So there are issues of inequality we have to address, but the fact that the data, but also the data on the economy are also reflected in the perception of people. What I think is fascinating is when you look at surveys of consumer sentiment, people are optimistic if you ask them how they feel in terms of the economy. I think we have two problems here. One is the confidence and the trust in the data, which, as you pointed out, is disgregating. And I think part of the reason why this is happening is now that data are so fashionable, everybody's taking over. Everybody's tweeting one piece of information or one impression, which is then sold as data, and once it's retweeted 10 times, it becomes accepted science and wisdom. The second problem I think we have is that the narrative remains more powerful than the data. We're still in a situation where perhaps because we haven't educated people enough to look at the data, think and trust the data, if you have a story which is sufficiently catchy, it will overwhelm the evidence.
But that's always going to be true, Marco, don't you think?
Yeah.
I mean,
That's why you're always going to have a job.
narratives are not going away. Maybe people need to figure out how to make their own narrative better.
I would complicate the story a little bit. I think you know, one of the things that we're learning as we analyze what we think is happening with the economic and financial lives of Americans, because we're starting with the Chase platform, which, as you know, is a U.S. retail platform, and therefore we're primarily informing what's happening in the U.S. economy to begin with, is that even as the economy has gotten stronger, the unemployment rate has come down to pretty historic levels. We've had 70 quarters of growth. I mean, it's really extraordinary. 70 months of continuous growth, employment growth. We've had, there's a level of anxiety that is permeated, and we observe that in the work that we do when we map income and consumption volatility for individuals. We find that most Americans are actually facing very high levels of income volatility, and that means that even when things are looking better, what they experience is a lot of uncertainty and a lot of anxiety, and that's part of what's playing out, which I think is not just, I completely agree with your point, Mark, about the narrative taking hold independent of data, but there is something real that I think a lot of our economic models have actually wiped away in the attempt to introduce, eliminate seasonality and smooth things out. That is not the reality of what most people are experiencing. So we see, for example, payroll coming in, and we're seeing take-home pay month to month is actually quite volatile for most Americans. 55% of Americans will see a swing in their income of over 30% on a month-to-month basis in any given year.
Wow.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, no wonder they're freaking out. You can't blame them, yeah.
That's exactly right. And no wonder that they're having a really hard time managing their finances, because so with income, so with consumption. So consumption volatility is also quite high. And when people live with a very small liquid buffer of assets, which we know they do, they don't have very many savings to rely on, those things send them into a real tailspin. And this is really important to understand, because low-income, people who follow low-income communities, et cetera, have been saying this for a long time, sort of the liquidity trap that many low-income Americans face. But what we found was this is true for almost all Americans. Quintiles 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them are facing these very high levels of income and consumption volatility, and they don't have the liquid buffer to withstand it. So you have to be in the top quintile not to have that be a real issue. So there is a real thing going on there.
Can I add just one comment and dimension, which I think another part of the problem is that so far the promise of the data has consistently outpaced the value that the data have actually delivered. And I'll give you an example. So we at GE are very big on the industrial internet, which is essentially building the complement to what Diana is doing, which is collecting data from all industrial machines, whether it's jet engines, gas turbines. And this is something that, combined with software, gradually gives you enormous efficiency gains. And it's something that we're puzzling in the US, why is US productivity growth so slow? I think as you see these innovations scale through the economy, productivity will be bootstrapped, will accelerate enormously. But there has been so much hype about data, and then when you look at the power that the data have really acted onto the economy, so far it's small. And I think this gap has undermined the credibility of data and has made it easier for the critics to say, well, the data are not really helping. Whereas what's happening is the data are laying the basis, we are laying the basis to use the data to generate value, and you will see that unfold over the coming years.
Well, one of the things that's implicit in what I think you're both saying, but particularly what you said a minute ago, Deanna, is that there are other measures that we need to be thinking about systemically, whether it's at the national government level or at the level of an institute like yours, which as it gains more credibility, maybe we'll be able to have influence. But, so I guess I'm curious how likely you think it is that we can redefine things like income, because in fact, you're saying if volatility is that important, it needs to be measured right alongside the amounts, right? And promulgated in the same way. But is there any hope that we'll move towards that kind of understanding of what's really going on?
I don't know. And there was a conversation yesterday, I think the fellow from OMB was talking about how there's been sort of this presumption that we're moving toward more and more integrated data systems, which I think would be necessary to do that. But there are lots of forces that are moving away from that, which are, fear of hacks and fear of this that are forcing people to kind of ring fence their data and making that harder. But I do think that one of the most important ways that could ever happen, one of the most important things that needs to happen for that is for data systems to be able to talk to each other in ways that give us a complete picture. So if you think about, for example, almost all of the data collection efforts that our government undertakes are narrow collections. So we have a consumer expenditure survey, and they go and they survey expenditures. They have a personal income survey, and they survey income. But nobody's connecting your income to your consumption in a way to really understand how these things come together. So the closest we have to that is the Survey of Consumer Finance, which the Fed does every 3 years for the nation as a whole. It's fewer than 5,000 households. It's done every 3 years, and It's not even longitudinal.
Meaning?
Meaning you're not tracking the same people over time.
Right,
so you're just taking a random sample every 5,000. So, for us to understand really important questions, we need to understand how is this playing out at the integrated view of income and consumption, assets and liabilities. That's what we're trying to build at the Institute. But will we get there? Only if we find ways of connecting the good data we have, the not so good data, and really bring them together. And I'm skeptical of that.
You have any thoughts on that?
Just that a lot of it will depend on our ability to collect the data in a faster, more objective and seamless way, because if the solution is to have an enormous survey over 3 years, that's never going to work. They have to be collected automatically at the point of transaction.
Objectivity is a weird word coming from GE and JP Morgan Chase, because we know the people generally don't trust companies like yours to begin with. Just period, right? I mean, GE's got great ads, but people still hate big companies. They even seem to hate capitalism in some ways, which in an interestingly new way. Meanwhile, I mean, that's an observation I'm just throwing out there, but what's amazing to me as a tech journalist, and I think this is right at the heart of what you're trying to accomplish, is we're having Fitbit on stage here in a few minutes. They have unbelievable data about tens of millions of people. If it were usable by some external system, there's got to be an opportunity there. Salesforce.com, amazing data about economic transactions, sales opportunities. That is a huge resource. Google, Facebook, these companies have macro data of enormous value. GE having its own sets of incredible data at a more industrial side. The opportunity clearly exists with a big bank like yours. all these institutions have this data. The opportunity is transparently obvious to be there to integrate it into a more holistic view. But frankly, it seems almost inconceivable that it could happen, and that feels like a tragedy.
It is a tragedy because I think you're exactly right, Marco. We're not going to create the public investment to build these data assets that we need. And so that means all we have is the private sector data assets that are being built as a result of real investments that are, have commercial value, et cetera. And we have to, I believe, most companies have to play a role in saying, let's take that window we have in the world and start informing what's happening out there. And that's certainly what we're trying to do here. Other folks, ADP does that with their payroll.
ADP, I should have mentioned that.
Others do, everyone's doing a piece of this. And I think there are some efforts. The Sloan Foundation, for example, has just funded an effort to try to say what would be that architecture, that backbone for standardizing data so that if we have, for example, and we do, a sample of 260,000 people earning income on the so-called gig economy, online platform jobs like Uber and Lyft and Airbnb, et cetera, we're beginning to understand how is that really shaping the world of work in meaningful ways, that could get connected with what the BLS is doing in contingent workforces. That's where we need to go, but it's going to be a long road.
But
I want to get back to the gig economy thing in a little while, but not right this second.
I'm actually a bit more optimistic than you, Diana, because I feel that there is an enormous incentive to integrate these data. So when you start looking at it from an industrial perspective, creating big data is the only way in which you can then generate efficiency, and so faster growth, more jobs, more productivity. Now, we are doing a lot of work with our customers, which means other companies in sensitive sectors like healthcare, aviation, oil and gas, and they want to be sure that the data is held correctly, it's handled correctly, it's secure. We're doing work with governments to try to dispel this risk that governments want to ring-fence data because they feel that all data is a privacy concern. But the strong incentive to do it is, number one, that you want to generate value. Number two, that we know that the generation of value is the only way you generate trust. Because it's true, as you were saying, that the companies the public now seems to paint all large companies and banks with the same brush and saying big business bad. But then millions and millions of people who say they don't trust GE, they put their lives in the hands of our healthcare equipment and our jet engines when they go in the air. So it's with the performance that you demonstrate trust. And I think aggregating the data takes you one step further.
For some reason, it reminds me of a comment that was made at our health section thing yesterday, which was preceded this conference, about airplanes almost always are flying by wire. They're almost always being flown by essentially robotic systems. And someone said, yes, and we still have an actor with a hat who has to sit in the cockpit. And that's pretty much the case. But so the problem, and that really almost, to some peculiar way, reinforces this problem. The people don't understand the systems that are surrounding them. They don't trust the right things. And I would say, to slightly segue to something different, the inability of government to recognize and act upon these issues at this scale, and I want you to comment based on your White House experience in a second on this, ends up reinforcing the respective power of the corporate sector over government. And for people who are concerned about income inequality and the rich getting richer, the companies are not afraid to look at this stuff more holistically and act accordingly. Meanwhile, government doesn't get it, and as a result is falling behind, and the public sector, the public good use of data is being essentially rejected in favor of just relinquishing it to people like JP Morgan Chase, who people don't trust in the first place. But whether you like it or not, you're going to use that, whether we like it or not, you're going to use that data to your own benefit. Why not? You should. It's your, you understand it. I mean, isn't that a weird dichotomy? And how does, when you were in the White House, how would you?
Yeah, no, I want to pick that up, because I think one of the most frightening things, so just paint a picture for you, go back, this is 2008. Lehman has just fallen. The world is kind of catastrophic. And, 700,000 jobs every month down the tube. 700,000 jobs. Just get your head around that, because it was a very, very frightening time. At that time, during transition in the early part of the administration, we were working very hard to try and justify the Recovery Act, for one, which is the $800 billion of stimulus, and also to understand where would the marginal dollar be best placed, given just the fact that there was chaos everywhere. We did not have the information to answer those questions properly. As it turned out, GDP decline, GDP contraction was revised 3 times after the fact, so that we now know that it was way worse than we thought it was when we were trying to intervene in policy. And frankly, that was one of the inspirations for me coming to start this institute at JPMorgan Chase, to say, where are we going to find enough view of what's happening in the economy where we could reconstruct it so that in the future we will know what's really happening on the ground at the very granular level. The housing crisis played out very differently across the country, but we did not have real-time kind of measures of what was happening county by county, which is what we would have wanted.
That's stunning. But do you agree that the public good would clearly be better served if government stepped up and took a much more aggressive effort to benefit from the existence of all these data sets?
I do. And I want to correct one small thing you said, David. I think there are people in government who get this.
Yeah.
I think the current administration, the Obama administration, actually put some real effort against this. They established a CTO. They, under Todd Park's leadership, when he was in that role, he really tried a very aggressive open data initiative across the government. So it's just really hard, because as it is in the private sector, where the real promise of this comes in is really strong integration, a lot of leadership, the boldness to make real investments. I mean, one thing JPMorgan Chase is really doing with this institute is they're putting the money where the mouth is. We're going to create this. This is for the public good. We're putting our research into the public domain. You can check it out on our website. But you can't do it on the cheap. You can't do, it's not that kind of thing. And so, do we have a constituency in government today that says this matters enough that we're going to do that? Certainly not in Congress. So I think there's some people who get it. I think that there is a couple bills out there that are trying to push some of this, but it's just the scale of imagination that is what's lacking at the moment.
Good. I'm glad you said that. Not good. Marco, I think no one here would be surprised that you're European. Your accent betrays you.
It's a style. It's a style.
What are you talking about? What accent? This problem in another form exists in Europe to a very significant degree, it seems to me. And there's 2 things I want you to comment on. One, you mentioned before the need to look at data sets across borders, and in fact the movement globally is towards quite the opposite, towards building walls, data, what's that term for?
Ring fencing?
There's a data something, I can't.
Call it balkanization.
Well, requiring the servers to be in the country where the citizens' data is existing, or the corporation's data. And at the same time, also in Europe, there's this obsession with privacy, which I understand, and I think in some ways has a lot of legitimacy, but is being taken to an extreme in the sense of, I think, potentially limiting the ability of data to serve society. Comment on both those things, and do you worry about the attitudes you see in Europe generally?
I worry about it enormously, because I think first of all, there is a misunderstanding of areas where privacy is a concern and areas where it shouldn't be. Because a lot of the industrial data, for example, data on the performance of individual jet engines, machines, they don't have any content which is privacy sensitive. And yet there is a tendency in Europe to paint everything with the same brush and think that those data should be treated with the same care. So I think that is absolutely crazy. The second thing I worry about is this mistaken impression that a lot of governments, especially in Europe, have that the priority should be to ring-fence data as if you could, as if putting them on a server within your borders made them secure. And secondly, not understanding that by doing this, by preventing companies and the data centers from bringing the data together, you are negating the value of big data. And then there's no point in collecting the data in the first place. Yeah. So this is something that worries me enormously, because I think it comes from an enormous lack of understanding, perhaps tied to the fact that the data revolution has actually started in the US, so Europe feels it is lagging behind. I think in this sense, adds to the feeling of insecurity and uncertainty. But I'm enormously worried by this because I think it's something that is a huge obstacle to the promise of value that big data is holding for industry and for the economy.
I want to make sure we don't lose your chance to talk about the gig economy, because you have just recently achieved some insights of a very interesting type based on what you're doing. So explain that.
So let me start with the narrative, which we would argue was probably a little bit wrong, which is the narrative was, yes, we know there's income volatility, but it's all because of the gig economy, and it's taken over, and it's Uber and Lyft and Airbnb and Etsy, and that's the future of work. And we said, okay, well, do we understand how big this is? Do we understand how this fits into total income for people? Do we understand who's participating, when they're participating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And go to the government. They don't even track this, so they have no way of in this. Folks like Alan Kruger and Harris did some really good survey-based work. MGI has also done some good survey-based work on contractors at large. But we said, what if we could identify across a large number of platforms, and we identified 30 platforms, labor platforms where a task is performed, so a driver, a dog walker, a shopper for you, or capital platforms where you're renting an asset or you are selling a good. And we sort of said, let's identify across those who's earning income on them and how this fits into their total income. So first thing we observe is that any given month, about 1% of adults are earning income on these platforms. Over the last 3 years, about 4% of adults have at one point or another. It tells you something. People come in and out of this all the time. And it's primarily young people, but you'll see people from across the spectrum. It's primarily low income, or it's predominantly disproportionately low income, but people across the spectrum. But by and large, for a lot of people, this is a supplemental form of income. Most of them have traditional jobs. They're doing this on the side. And for those who are unemployed, who are participating, as soon as they get a job, they often quit. So we don't see this as the future of work the way a lot of people have seen it. We've seen this as an important integration into the labor market, particularly to help offset income volatility. We see that people work more in order to offset volatility in the traditional source of income. And we were able to collect a sample of 260,000 people earning income, where we observe not just what they're earning, but what they're spending, to have these kinds of insights.
But also, didn't you kind of maybe identify it may have peaked?
Yes.
Explain that.
So this is important. Growth rates have been phenomenal. In the last 3 years, number of earners has grown 47-fold. That's ridiculous growth rates. It's 300-400.
In this gig economy?
In these online platform economies, we observe dramatic growth. But then we tried to map the trajectory of growth. And what we're finding is that growth is, in fact, peaked in 2014. And it's still growing very fast, let's be clear, but it's no longer growing at those very high rates. And we do see that the ability of these platforms to attract people is going to get harder as the economy continues to recover, if the economy continues to recover.
Since they use it as a fill-in mechanism.
Exactly.
That's interesting. Okay, we are pretty much out of time, but I would love to have at least one super pointed question. Is that Dan Elron? Okay. If it's Dan Elron, it will be a good question. And okay, then we'll...
Yeah, hi, Dan
We'll get
Elron,
Ken too.
Accenture.
I'm not going to keep Ken out of this. Okay, Dan.
Yeah, I was a little surprised by the fact that we're focusing so hard on objective data. There is the theory that people are very unhappy because they're not having as much fun as their friends on Facebook. So the psychology dimension here, especially on the consumer side, I think you touched upon that in terms of variability, is huge. I know that Bhutan is trying to measure national happiness. Where are we on kind of the subjective drivers of welfare, if you will, or happiness? Because that seems to have driven a lot of the election. It wasn't the objective standard of living, it is a lot of other things.
So two thoughts on that. One is that the best measures of that subjective thing you're trying to get at are sort of surveys, happiness surveys. And there are surveys that go around asking people, are you happy? And by happy, I mean, would you want to continue? I mean, this is not my definition. Danny Kahneman, Nobel Prize winner who's done a lot of work in this area, sort of says, definition of happiness is, would you be happy continuing to do what you're doing? That's the definition of happy, as opposed to unhappy, you want to stop what you're doing, or as opposed to neutral, meaning I'm indifferent whether I stay or go. And I think so that creates a really big problem, because this election showed that people were not happy, i.e. they wanted change, but they had no conception of what it changed to what, clearly, because it wasn't I don't think an absorption of the policies that were being recommended. It was just the desire to not do what they were doing now, whatever that was. So I don't think we've gotten very far on that subjective measure of it. I think on the GDP measurement stuff, we do have a crisis of understanding what it is that we want to measure. So the biggest problem with GDP today is that it doesn't measure consumer surplus. So the fact that we all have our phones, and you can now Google get on the map, and immediately you don't have to get directions from everybody. You can take a picture of your friends. You can do this. All this actually is not translating into any GDP impact at all.
Eric Brynjolfsson talked about that at Techonomy 3 years ago.
That's right.
One of the first
and
times.
If anything, it could be GDP destroying, because Kodak's out of the picture. All these other things that were contributing positively to GDP are not, and yet people are better off. Our GDP numbers don't show that. So do we, and some people say, well, they were never meant to show that. They're meant to show commercial value, things that get commercialized. So I think we do have a crisis of saying, what is it that we really want to measure? And I would argue we have to move to a consumer surplus measurement, that at the end of the day, an economy has to serve people's well-being. That's what matters, not production in its own right. But we're a long way from that.
We need a whole conference on this stuff.
I agree.
Let's go to Ken, because we're really short on time.
Sure. Ken Washington, Ford Motor Company. Before that, I worked in the government sector. So I may be one of the few people in the room that has had a security clearance with insight into the nature and the depth and the breadth of the type of information that's collected on people by the government, and the pace at which a wide variety of commercial companies like Ford has the ability to collect data on people using probes like cars. And quite frankly, that's one of the reasons why there's so much buzz about autonomous vehicles, because when you put millions of vehicles on the road that have sensors all over them and supercomputers in their trunk, the ability to collect massive troves of data of insight about people and things and businesses becomes enormous. And so it's a huge economic opportunity. And you can say the same thing about a whole list of companies that David started to list but didn't complete it. And so I guess my comment is that it seems to me that the issue of the value of the horizontal integration and the stitching together of data so that people can have insight that will either drive new business and economics or create value for them as a person, that seems to be missing, because there are few horizontal integrators that cut across federal government and commercial sectors. In fact, there's none. And so I think that's and David said it, it's a travesty that seems to be incredibly difficult to harness and leverage the data about me as a person that the government has on me, and that these dozens and dozens of companies have about me. And so what are we going to do as a society to enable that, to make the quality of life of everyday citizens better? And that's why people feel like life isn't getting better, because they kind of know that this data is out there and they don't have access to it because the standards aren't in place, or they're not educated enough, or the tools aren't available for them to get it. And so it seems to me that that's the opportunity of some entrepreneur or business or government-sponsored agency would be tasked or tapped to create this capability so that David and Ken and Joe and Fred and Mark and Mary could actually open up a laptop or a computer and get information about them, about their health, about their experiences, insight about their kids, and so on and so forth.
Really quick, any comments, because we really
Yeah, just very quick comments on this. So first of all, I think this will happen in the future. I'm convinced we will be able to leverage the data horizontally to create value. We need to be very clear in showing that we are creating value so that the data that is collected is easily used to improve the experience and the life of people. In the case of data collected from the government, for example, my point has always been that I don't mind the government knowing everything about me, but then for God's sake, don't treat me as a complete stranger every single week when I show up at the airport. And the other point I would make to the issue of on the first question, I completely agree we need to move towards consumer surplus and have a better measurement of actual economic activity as it creates value for all of us. I think in terms of measures of subjective measures of how people feel, I think we need better surveys. We need perhaps to tap into healthcare data, environmental data that can give us something more tangible on how the mood of people can be measured in a physiological way. And I would just add to finish that is going to be extremely important as we move towards a world where the connection and cooperation of machines and humans becomes more and more important. So we need to understand the machines, but also how the human feels and reacts.
Yeah, we got to wrap. But one thing I would say to you, Ken, is I think that if there's anybody trying to do that, I think there are 3 companies that can easily be named that are trying to do that, and that's Facebook, Google, and Amazon. And they are moving quite quickly and doing it relatively effectively. They're creating consumer surplus in doing so, but they have enormous opportunities. That's one reason they are so powerful, why people use them, even if they have a lot of ambivalence about their power. So thank you all. A very meaty conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks.